Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. We have a lot to talk about around this Florida State program as it pertains to the transfer portal. Now, I think I want to spend the majority of our time talking about some options that have emerged for Florida State in the portal and talk about some guys that Florida State has offered over the last couple of days. I think you have to start the conversation, though, with where this roster sits right now, especially as you lost three wide receivers to the transfer portal over the last couple of days. Look, I get it. I get the concern for a lot of Florida State fans when just on the surface you look and say, all right, we got three players all in the same position room that have hit the transfer portal over the last couple of days. It's especially not ideal in the spring as you don't have a ton of time to kind of reload the clip and address the position. I get the concern. I would strongly advise some Florida State fans who might be a little concerned about that to focus on, hey, what's the context of this? Now, this is after coming out of spring practice where it sounds like the year one wide receivers are legit for Florida State. You know, a guy like Javon Boggs. It sounds like you're getting a bunch of your year two wide receivers that have clearly taken a step, guys like Elijah Moore. I don't think it's a coincidence that your year three wide receivers are hitting the portal after we heard a lot of good things about some of the other young wide receivers on this football team. You look at a guy like Akeem Williams. I look at this situation, and again, it's never fun to lose a football player that we know has the potential that Akeem Williams has. I think this is a mutually beneficial thing. You know, Akeem Williams, it clearly just wasn't working at Florida State. You know, whether it was injuries, whether it was player development, he just never really seemed to turn the corner. And we thought he might turn the corner at certain times during his time at Florida State. That never really seemed to happen. You don't blame Akeem Williams for, hey, maybe finding a different environment where you can maybe reach some of that potential. For Florida State, I think it's you could argue this is probably a benefit too. I mean, we all know the resources that it took to get Akeem Williams to commit to Florida State out of high school. You quite frankly paying him a lot of money to not be a productive wide receiver in your room. He's going into year three, probably was not going to start in the 2025 season. For Florida State, it's probably a benefit too. You know, you probably missed on the evaluation. It did not. You took a risk on a guy like Akeem Williams. You know, coming out of high school, he left his senior year, didn't even catch for over 1,000 yards. There was a lot of development. He was a very raw player. You kind of took a risk on the upside of a player like Akeem Williams in it. It probably didn't work out. Well, now you have some significant amount of resources that was supposed to go to Hakeem Williams in year three that now you can use to probably get some more productive football players into this program going into 2025. So I get the concern that some Florida State fans have, no doubt. Like on the surface, losing three wide receivers in a room that you already had some question marks about, no doubt it is reason for somewhat concern. But I also think there are some things to be excited about with this situation as well. Now, I think it's very clear Florida State needs to go out and get at least one more wide receiver going into 2025. We're going to talk about a few of those options before we get into it. As always, the Florida State fans, let it fly in the comment section. Hey, maybe I'm being a little too much of a sunshine pumper here. That's kind of my read on the situation. Would love to hear from y'all in the comment section. And like that, that's the beauty of talking ball in the spring. Like, whoever's listening to this, chances are you live and breathe the program and follow this program pretty damn closely, and you might have an opinion that differs from mine. Let it fly in the comment section. We'll chop it up. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. And let's start with, really a name that I feel like really represents how Florida State has operated in the transfer portal over the last couple of months. And that is, hey, Trayshawn Hurry coming from San Jose State is not going to be a marquee name. I'll be the first one to admit, before I started talking about him, I had to go back and watch a little bit of him and kind of get a feel for who he was. But he's been productive at all levels of college football he's played, at the FCS ranks, then moves up to the G5 ranks. And I think just as importantly, he's a good fit in this Florida State offense. We've been talking about it all spring long. Like, what does Gus Malzahn want to do on offense? Hey, number one, we want to run the football. Like, we're going to run the football a lot in the 2025 year. But when we do decide to throw it, We want to push that sucker down the field. Like, we're going play action and we're going to push the ball down the field. If you want to do that, you got to get some wide receivers that are big bodies that can work vertically down the field. Trayshawn Hurry, he's 17.1 yards per catch at San Jose State last year. Again, he's not a guy that is a national media name, a marquee household name, but this is a guy that's been productive at the college level, that fits what you want to do on offense. That's the recipe for what Florida State has done in the transfer portal, and I like it. I think you spent way too much time 12 months ago betting on so many guys that were not proven contributors in college. That Florida State's doing a complete 180. We're saying we ain't going to give a bunch of money to guys that haven't contributed in college. We're going to go out and get guys that have shown they can be solid football players, that we know can come in and impact our roster in a positive way. Trayshawn Hurry is one of those guys. Another name that is certainly worth monitoring is Keelan Marion from BYU. This is a guy that it seems like a lot of teams across the country want. What I love about Keelan Marion is there's a lot of different ways that you can use this kid. You can put him in the slot. You can put him in the boundary. He is an elite kick returner as well. Very good with the football in his hands. Reliable guy that's caught for over 1,000 yards during his college football career going into year 5. Guy that you can do a lot of different things with. Another name that makes sense for Florida State. I don't think Florida State needs to go out there and pay a bunch of money for a wide receiver one, because I think you have your 2 top wide receivers on this football team, and Deuce Robinson and Squirrel White. Go get one more, proven contributor, because you look at the Florida State wide receiver room and say, look, we like the talent in this room. We'll pull up the depth chart real quick. Deuce Robinson, Squirrel White, those are 2 NFL guys. I think the conversation is after those 2, we're pretty dang young. LeWayne McCoy going into year 2, Elijah Moore year 2, Javon Boggs year 1, Tayshaun Yelzy year 1. Probably want to go get one more name that's been around the sport for a little bit. Both Trayshawn Hurry and Keelan Marion would make a lot of sense for Florida State in the wide receiver room. The other position that I'd like to see Florida State at least do their due diligence is on the offensive line. And look, I think Florida State's in a decent spot, because if you're Florida State, you don't have to go out and get a starting offensive tackle. You did that in the winter. One of the biggest wins for Florida State is they completely revamped their offensive line, and it sounds like they're pretty happy with that unit. Now, the big question for Florida State is the depth. I think you've heard some good things from guys like John Daniels and Lucas Simmons in spring. You probably want to get 1 or 2 more offensive linemen that you can trust can go out and play solid football. And I think the second conversation is, look at all those names that are going to start for Florida State. Well, they're going to be seniors. A lot of those guys are leaving the program after this year. So you can use the transfer portal for 2 things. One, let's go get some quality depth for this unit immediately in 2025. But what you can also sell a lot of those guys in the portal is, we can't promise you a starting spot in 2025, because we kind of have our starting 5 offensive line. We can promise you a spot in the 2 deep, but then in 2026, you're going to have a great opportunity to start for this Florida State football team with an offensive line coach that I think is really good at developing players and getting the best out of players. One name that I think would make a lot of sense is Blake Steen. St. Thomas Aquinas kid down in the state of Florida. Has started a bunch of games for Virginia. And look, I ain't going to get up here and tell you it was great. Going back and looking at some of the film from him at Virginia in 2024, it's not perfect. You might go out and say. What I like about Blake Steen is, 1, starting experience in the ACC. That matters. Number 2, I think you get some position versatility. Played right tackle for Virginia. Played a little left tackle in the 2023 year. I think he'd be probably a better guard than he is tackle. You add Blake Steen and say he could be your 3rd tackle to come in if you need him to play. He also probably could play guard and probably could be a pretty dang good guard and fits what Florida State wants to do. This is a bigger offensive tackle that might not be the fleetest of foot in pass protection. He can move some bodies off the line of scrimmage. And so it's a guy that, hey, we know Gus Malzahn wants to run the football. Well, Blake Steen, although we may have some question marks in pass protection, he can move bodies off the line of scrimmage and help you run the football. Blake Steen would make a lot of sense. Cash Cleveland from Colorado would make a lot of sense. This is a guy as a true freshman, walk-on true freshman last year. Started the last 5 games of the season for Colorado and quite frankly, played some pretty solid football. I look at him and say, you could bring in Cash Cleveland. You could redshirt him this year. And he have 3 years of eligibility remaining and probably be a multi-year starter at center for Florida State over the next couple of years. This is a kid that, was playing undersized. You could tell he was a walk-on on the football field last year for Colorado, but he's a heady guy that plays with good leverage and knows what he's doing on the football field, especially for a true freshman. Like, this is a guy that you can come and he'd probably be maybe would be your center too. Ideally, you could redshirt him and Luke Pettymon stays healthy. And you got a potential 3-year starter starting in 2026. When I look at Florida State and where they're going, to me, it's, you want to win football games in 2025, but you want to make sure you're setting up to really build back to where you belong as a program. You can use the transfer portal to do that. I feel like a lot of people assume the transfer portals for 1-year rentals. And there are certain cases where it is for 1-year rentals, a lot of cases. Well, there's also a lot of cases where you can grab guys that are going to be, look at when Florida State had that year in 2023, you had a lot of guys that you brought in through the transfer portal that were year 2 guys, Jared Verse. I don't think a lot of us expected him to be 2 years, but he ended up being 2 years at Florida State, and that paid off and was a large part of why Florida State was so damn good in the 2023 year. You can use the transfer portal to set up for the future too. Cash Cleveland would make a lot of sense. Zaquan Patterson, another true freshman. I think Florida State is looking for some depth at the safety position. And look, it wasn't perfect for Zaquan Patterson. The Miami Hurricane fans would be the first ones to tell you that. What they'd also say is there wasn't a single player that played very good football and defense for Miami. I think that had a lot more to do with the coaching staff and how they were coaching these guys up and what they were doing on defense than a guy like Zaquan Patterson. There was a couple of things that were kind of working against Zaquan. One, he was forced to play when he was clearly not ready. He was playing in a defense where every single player in that defense played worse than we expected. Even your good players like Francis Mauigoa or a guy like Ruben Bain, or Francisco Mauigoa at linebacker, Ruben Bain at edge. There were a lot of players that got worse in that defense. That's all to say that, look, I'm not ready to just sell my stock on Zaquan Patterson, even though it wasn't perfect for him as a true freshman. Another guy that you could redshirt and have 3 years of eligibility with starting in 2026. A lot of options, for Florida State. And I think what I really like about Florida State is, look, they did the bulk of their work in the winter. Now it's just about putting the cherry on top. I think you feel good about a lot of positions, but we're just looking for a couple more role players, depth on the offensive line. There are names out there that Florida State can be helped by. We'll see where they decide to go. We'll sign out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.